December. 1946. The mood on the docks of Halifax was not just grim, it was apocalyptic. German prisoners of war, fresh from the burning wreckage of the European theater, stumbled off transport ships and onto the soil of a country they had been conditioned to fear more than death itself. As they marched down the gangplanks, the wind off the North Atlantic didn't just blow, it bit. It screamed. Temperatures plunged toward 40 degrees below zero. A cold so absolute, so alien to the European constitution, that it felt like a physical assault. To these men, this was not a relocation, it was an execution. They were convinced that Canada was a frozen wasteland, a primitive, icy purgatory, where survival was a mathematical impossibility. They believed that within days, the elements would finish what the Royal Navy had started. But history, as it often does, had a twist in store. Instead of watching these enemies freeze into statues of ice, Canadian guards and local farmers were about to dismantle the entire worldview of the Third Reich. They would do it not with bullets, but with wool socks, bacon, and central heating. What could enemy civilians possibly teach battle-hardened Wehrmacht soldiers that would shatter their faith in the Führer? Why would thousands of these men, after the war, choose to abandon the fatherland they fought for to return to the very land that imprisoned them? To understand this, we must first look at the world they left behind. Europe was burning. By late 1940, the German war machine was not just winning, it was unstoppable. For 18 straight months, the Wehrmacht had crushed every nation that dared to stand in its path. Poland had fallen in weeks. A lightning war that stunned the world. Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and finally France, the great military power of the continent, had all collapsed under the terrifying weight of panzer divisions and the shrieking dive of Stuka bombers. The Nazi swastika now flew unchallenged from the frozen fjords of Norway down to the sunny, occupied beaches of France. Adolf Hitler stood as the undisputed master of continental Europe, his dominion stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Spanish border. Only Britain remained, isolated, battered, and bleeding. The last free nation in Western Europe stood alone against the darkness. Every night, the Luftwaffe turned the sky over London into a canvas of fire, raining bombs down in a relentless attempt to break the British spirit. But across the gray expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, Canada was watching, and Canada was preparing. This was a nation of only 11.5 million people, a population smaller than some European regions, yet they had made a choice that would alter the course of history. Over 200,000 Canadian soldiers had already crossed the dangerous ocean to fight. At home, the transformation was total. Factories that once manufactured tractors were retooled to weld tanks. Shipyards operated day and night, sparks flying around the clock. Building the corvettes needed to hunt the wolf packs of German submarines. Every able-bodied man between 18 and 40 was gone, either overseas, training to go, or sweating in a war factory. Canada had mortgaged its entire future on stopping Hitler. But this total mobilization created a logistical nightmare nobody had anticipated. The Atlantic was becoming a graveyard for German U-boats, and the skies over Britain were filling with parachutes. German prisoners were arriving not in trickles, but by the shipload. Hundreds became thousands. These were the elite of the German military, men pulled from sinking U-boats in the freezing North Atlantic, their vessels sent to the bottom by Canadian corvettes. Luftwaffe pilots shot down during the Battle of Britain, sailors from surface raiders that had terrorized Allied convoys. When the first prison ships steamed into Halifax harbor that late autumn, the air was thick with tension. Guards marched the prisoners off the decks and loaded them onto trains, sealing them in for a journey into the unknown. These trains would carry them deep into the Canadian interior, to places with names that felt harsh and foreign on German tongues. Camp 30 near Bowmanville, Ontario. Camp 133 at Lethbridge, Alberta. Camps in Quebec and New Brunswick. They were being scattered across a country so vast that the entirety of Germany could fit inside it 3 times over with room to spare. As the trains rumbled west, the German prisoners stared out the windows, and a creeping dread began to set in. The landscape rolling past was terrifying in its emptiness. They saw forests that stretched to the horizon, dark and impenetrable. They saw farms that were larger than entire German municipalities. They saw small towns that defied their expectations, towns with electric streetlights, paved roads, and more automobiles than they had seen in Berlin. But mostly, they felt the cold. With every mile north and west, the temperature dropped. Frost began to creep up the corners of the train windows. These men had been prepared for battle, but they had been lied to about Canada. Their officers had briefed them extensively. The Nazi propaganda ministry had published terrifying reports. Canada, they were told, was a primitive colonial backwater. It was a land of pioneers and savages, where civilized men could not survive. The winters were described as lethal weapons. Temperatures dropped so low that exposed skin would freeze solid in minutes. Winds howled across empty plains with nothing to stop them, flaying the flesh from anyone foolish enough to step outside. Men caught in a Canadian winter storm didn't just get cold, they died, frozen where they stood. The prisoners believed these stories. Why wouldn't they? They had no reason to doubt their superiors, and none of them had ever set foot in North America. To them, the encroaching winter was a death sentence. When they finally arrived at the camps, their fears seemed confirmed. They saw wooden barracks surrounded by wire fences, with guard towers looming at each corner and searchlights sweeping the snow-covered grounds at night. The camps looked flimsy, temporary, hastily thrown together structures of wooden walls and tar paper roofs. They looked nothing like the solid stone and concrete bunkers of Germany. The prisoners looked at these thin walls and thought, asterisk, how? Asterisk, how could these fragile buildings possibly protect anyone from the killing cold they had been warned about? November bled into December. The temperature dropped. Then it dropped again. By early January 1941, the thermometers in the camps read 30 degrees below zero, Celsius 22 below Fahrenheit. But the wind was the real killer. It drove the wind chill down to 40 below zero or worse. The prisoners had never experienced anything like this. It was a cold that hurt to breathe, a cold that froze the moisture in your nose instantly. Inside the barracks, they huddled together, terrified. Many still wore their modified German uniforms, wool coats, that were adequate for a mild European winter, but were as useless as paper against the Canadian prairie wind. They piled every blanket they owned onto their bunks. They stayed inside, motionless, conserving energy, waiting for the inevitable. They waited for men to start dying. The German officers held emergency meetings in the freezing barracks. They discussed rationing movement to conserve body heat. They identified the weakest men, those likely to succumb first. They drafted grim reports to send back to Germany, detailing the inhuman conditions, assuming any of them would survive to mail them. Some men wrote farewell letters to their wives and mothers, describing the brutal, alien cold and saying goodbye. At night, the wind screamed across the prairie and through the Ontario hills, finding every microscopic crack in the wooden walls. It rattled the windows in their frames. The sound was terrifying, like a living, hungry beast prowling the perimeter, looking for a way in. The prisoners lay in their bunks, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they would wake up, or if the cold would take them in their sleep. This, they thought, was the end. Not glory on the battlefield, but a frozen, forgotten death in a prisoner camp on the wrong side of the world. But morning came, and the prisoners were still alive. What happened next was not a miracle, but a systematic dismantling of everything the Germans thought they knew about their enemy. The prisoners were bracing for death, rationing their movements, when the Canadians, the very people supposed to be their jailers, intervened with a practicality that was shocking. They started teaching the Germans how to survive. It began with boxes. Canadian guards arrived at the barracks, carrying large wooden crates and cardboard boxes. They didn't dump them and leave. They opened them and began a distribution that left the Germans bewildered. Out came wool socks thick, heavy, gray wool, 3 pairs for every man. then fur-lined mittens that extended past the wrist to seal the sleeves, knitted scarves in bright colors, clearly handmade, heavy coats known as mackinaws, lined with dense wool and built to withstand the worst blizzards, and woolen hats the Canadians called toques, pronounced 2K, designed to pull down over the ears. But it wasn't just the gear, it was the knowledge. A farmer's wife from a nearby town, hearing that the prisoners were freezing because of ignorance, arrived one morning with her teenage daughter. She marched from barracks to barracks, acting not as an enemy, but as a mother. She showed these battle-hardened soldiers how to wrap a scarf properly, tucking the ends inside the coat to create a seal. She demonstrated how to stomp the snow off boots before entering a warm building, explaining that melted snow meant wet feet, and wet feet meant frostbite. Her daughter taught them to pull their wool socks up over their pant legs to create a gaiter, preventing snow from creeping in. These were simple things, lessons every Canadian child learned before they could walk. But to the Germans, these were revelations. They were survival secrets that meant the difference between keeping their toes and losing them to gangrene. The guards stayed to explain the physics of warmth. Layer your clothing. They instructed. They explained that one thick layer was useless compared to several thin layers. The air trapped between the layers acted as insulation, a barrier against the cold. Keep moving, they said. Generate heat, but do not sweat. Sweating was dangerous. Wet clothing froze. They taught the Germans the warning signs. Protect the nose, the ears, the fingers. If you see white patches on a comrade's face, tell him immediately. That is frostbite starting. The Germans listened. They learned. They had no choice. The arrogance of the conqueror melted away, replaced by the humility of the survivor. They realized that these Canadians understood the winter in a way they never could. And more importantly, the guards weren't just keeping them alive to follow regulations. There was a humanity here, a refusal to let men die of stupidity, even if those men were the enemy. Then came the food. If the clothing was a surprise, the food was a psychological shock. In the camps, breakfast was served at 7. The prisoners lined up with metal trays, expecting the standard prisoner fare of watery gruel and stale bread, the rations they had heard about in other wars. Instead, they were handed bowls of steaming hot porridge mixed with brown sugar. Next came 4 strips of bacon, crispy, hot, and greasy, fresh bread, baked that morning, accompanied by real butter and coffee. Not the ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns and chicory that Germans had been forced to drink for years as the British blockade strangled their supply lines, but real coffee, with real milk. One U-boat officer, a man who had faced death in the Atlantic, stared at his tray in disbelief. He wrote in his diary that night that he was eating better as a prisoner in Canada than he had as an active duty officer in Berlin. He did the math, 2,800 calories a day. In Germany, civilians were scraping by on ration cards that barely kept them alive. Here, in the enemy's prison, they ate like kings. Lunch brought beef stew loaded with carrots and potatoes, chunks of real meat, not filler. Dinner was roast pork, chicken, or beef, always accompanied by fresh vegetables from root cellars, and dessert apple pie, bread pudding with raisins, cookies. The prisoners couldn't process the abundance. Where did it come from? How could Canada afford to feed prisoners this well? The guards would casually share their thermoses of hot coffee during work details, pouring cups for the prisoners and chatting like co-workers on a break. When the Germans expressed their shock, the guards would shrug and say, "That's just how things are done here. Geneva Convention." You know, but it was more than rules. It was a demonstration of absolute logistical superiority. It was a message. Asterisk. We have so much food. We can afford to fatten up our enemies. The technology was the final blow to their worldview. The barracks, flimsy as they looked, were equipped with central heating systems. Basements housed massive furnaces, burning coal or oil, sending hot water through pipes in the walls. Thermostats kept the interior at a steady 18 degrees Celsius, 64 Fahrenheit. regardless of whether it was 35 below outside. Hot water flowed from taps on command. Electric lights burned without flickering, a stark contrast to the blackouts and power rationing of German cities. At the camp in Medicine Hat, Alberta, fresh milk was delivered every morning by truck. But not just any truck, a refrigerated truck. This detail astounded the prisoners. Canada had such extensive infrastructure that they used specialized refrigerated trucks to keep milk cold in summer and prevent it from freezing in winter. Germany was struggling to find enough trucks to move ammunition to the front lines, relying heavily on horses. Yet here, Canada used advanced automotive technology just to deliver milk to prisoners. Local farmers began hiring prisoner work gangs for the harvest, specifically for sugar beets. The prisoners rode in trucks to the farms, working the frozen ground. It was hard labor, but they were paid 25 cents a day in camp script currency they could spend at the camp store on chocolate, cigarettes, and toiletries. In Europe, forced labor was the norm. Here, they earned wages, but it was working on these farms that truly opened their eyes. They saw machinery they had only seen in propaganda films. Equipment the Nazis claimed was a lie of American cinema. One farmer in southern Alberta owned 3 tractors for a single 640-acre farm. 3 tractors. In Germany, an entire village might share a single tractor. If they were lucky, most still used draft animals. These Canadian farmers operated combines, mechanical seeders, and harvesting equipment that did the work of 50 men. Their barns were larger than German houses. Their silos held more grain than a German commune produced in a decade. The scale of the industrial capacity was undeniable. The camp commanders even arranged for prisoners to attend local hockey games. They flooded ponds in the camps to create skating rinks. The guards, continuing their education of the enemy, taught the Germans how to skate backward, how to stop by digging in their blades, and how to handle a puck. Through the steam of their breath on the ice, through the warmth of the Mackinaw coats, and through the fullness of their stomachs, the prisoners learned the most dangerous lesson of all. They realized that the propaganda was a lie. Canada was not a primitive wasteland. It was a sleeping giant of industry and agriculture. A land of such staggering abundance that it could treat its enemies with a dignity that Germany could no longer afford for its own citizens. They realized that a nation that could feed prisoners steak and pie while fighting a global war was a nation that could not be defeated by starvation or fear. The cold didn't kill them because the civilization they had underestimated was strong enough to tame it. And as they skated on the frozen ponds, surrounded by guards who offered them coffee instead of cruelty, many of them realized that the war was already lost. They had been sent to a frozen hell, but they had found a land of life, and that revelation would haunt them, and eventually bring many of them back long after the guns fell silent. Canadians didn't just survive the winter, they embraced it. They lived in it. They had built an entire sport around ice and cold, transforming a frozen landscape into an arena of joy. They held parties and vibrant festivals in the dead of winter, defying the elements with a spirit that baffled their captives. Children played outside in weather that would have kept German children locked indoors, huddled by coal stoves. For the locals, the winter wasn't killing them. It wasn't even trying. The Canadians had tamed it somehow, turned it from a lethal enemy into just another part of life. Something to work with instead of fight against. And slowly, as the prisoners learned these lessons about survival, something deeper started shifting inside them. The change came slowly at first, like ice melting at the jagged edges of a frozen lake. But the implications were devastating to their worldview. The German prisoners started asking questions they'd never thought to ask before, dangerous questions that unraveled the very fabric of the ideology they had fought for. The logic was inescapable. If Canada could feed its prisoners better than Germany fed its own officers, what did that say about German strength? If Canadian farmers owned more machinery tractors, combines, trucks than German factories could produce for the war effort, what did that say about German industrial power? If ordinary Canadian families donated warm clothing to enemy soldiers, what did that say about the relentless German propaganda claiming that non-Germanic peoples were inferior, weak, and barbaric. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. They had been told they were the master race, destined to rule a world of inferiors. Yet, here they were, defeated not by weapons, but by abundance and decency. Christmas 1941 brought everything into sharp, painful focus. The prisoners woke that morning expecting nothing special. Christmas in a prison camp, they reasoned, should be just another day of confinement, perhaps slightly worse, because the silence would remind them of the homes they might never see again and the families who were likely starving. They braced themselves for a day of melancholic reflection. Instead, the camp commanders announced a special Christmas dinner, strictly following the Geneva Convention traditions for the treatment of prisoners. But what awaited them went far beyond the requirements of international law. As they filed into the dining hall, the air was heavy with a scent that many of them had forgotten existed, the smell of a feast. The kitchen staff had been cooking since before dawn, preparing a meal that would shatter the prisoners' resolve more effectively than any interrogation. They brought out roast turkeys, golden brown and glistening, stuffed with a savory bread, stuffing mixed with sage and onions. Mashed potatoes arrived in huge, steaming bowls, topped with pools of melted butter and accompanied by serving boats filled with rich, brown gravy. Cranberry sauce, bright red and sweet tart, sat in dishes on every table. A splash of color against the drab uniforms. Fresh rolls, still warm from the oven, came with even more butter. And then came the dessert. 3 different types of pie followed the main course. Apple pie dusted with cinnamon and sugar, pumpkin pie topped with clouds of whipped cream, and mincemeat pie, a rich, spiced delight that some prisoners had never even heard of before. Coffee, a rarity in Europe, flowed freely. Chocolate bars sat at every place setting like small ingots of gold. The prisoners sat at the tables in stunned silence at first. The clattering of cutlery was the only sound. Many had tears in their eyes, overwhelmed not just by the hunger, but by the sheer shock of it. They hadn't seen this much food since before the war started. Some of the younger men, conscripted from poor rural areas, had never seen a feast like this in their entire lives. German families had been tightening their belts since 1939. Ration cards controlled every gram of sustenance. Butter was a luxury. Real coffee had disappeared years ago, replaced by bitter chicory substitutes. Meat came once or twice a week, if you were lucky, and here they sat prisoners of war, despised enemies, eating better than any German family would eat that Christmas. But the food was just the beginning of the psychological dismantling. Canadian families had sent Christmas packages to the camps. Boxes arrived by the dozens, each one addressed to the prisoners in general, not to anyone specific. Inside were hand-knitted socks with intricate patterns of snowflakes and reindeer. Homemade cookies wrapped in wax paper.
Beautiful.
Still fresh and sweet. Tins of tobacco for the men who smoked. Playing cards, books, and letters. Letters from Canadian women and children. Complete strangers, wishing the prisoners a Merry Christmas and hoping they were well. A prisoner named Ernst Bauer sat in his barracks that night, staring at a blank page, trying to write a letter home to his mother. The camp censors would read it before it got mailed, he knew that, but he had to try to explain the inexplicable. He wrote slowly, choosing each word with agonizing care, trying to bridge the gap between the propaganda his mother heard on the radio and the reality he was living. Mother, I don't know how to explain this. He wrote, his hand trembling slightly. We are prisoners, and yet we are treated like guests who have fallen on hard times. The local church sent us hymnals in German, so we could sing Christmas carols in our own language. A farmer's wife brought us stollen. She baked herself. The same Christmas bread we used to have at home. I have not felt this kind of human warmth since before the war. What have we become in Germany that we forgot this is how civilized people behave? The letter troubled the camp censor who read it. Not because it revealed military secrets or contained escape plans, but because it revealed something far more dangerous to the German war effort, a shift in the prisoner's mind. It was the sound of blind loyalty breaking. The censor filed the letter in a folder of similar letters that were arriving more and more frequently. The prisoners were changing. They were being de-radicalized, not by force, but by the undeniable evidence of a better way of life. Recognizing this shift, the camp commanders started allowing educational programs. Camp 30 became almost like a university behind barbed wire. Prisoners who had been professors, engineers, or teachers before the war began organizing classes. They taught engineering courses, philosophy, languages, mathematics, and history. The Canadian government, seeing the value in preparing these men for a post-war world, provided 200 textbooks, shipping them to the camp at government expense. The prisoners could even take correspondence courses with real Canadian universities and earn legitimate academic credits that would be recognized after the war. The classes became popular quickly. Men who'd spent years in the Hitler Youth being told that strength, violence, and military power were all that mattered, now sat quietly learning about literature, art, and science. They read books that had been banned in Germany. They discussed ideas that would have gotten them arrested by the Gestapo back home. The Canadian Guards didn't care what they read or discussed, as long as it wasn't escape plans. They understood that a man reading Goethe or studying calculus was a man reclaiming his humanity. But the deepest lessons came from the winter itself, and how Canadians had taught them to survive it. The prisoners began to understand that cooperation and community knowledge were more powerful than any individual strength or racial purity. When a guard showed a prisoner how to bank snow against a building for extra insulation, he wasn't just teaching a survival trick. He was showing that humans survive by sharing what they know, by helping each other, by building on the knowledge of everyone who came before. The locals, farmers, townspeople, guards were teaching them that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the hardest. It was about working together against the common enemy, the cold. One prisoner had his awakening during a blizzard in February 1943. His name was Klaus Hermann, and he'd been a Hitler Youth leader before joining the Luftwaffe. He was a true believer, convinced of German racial superiority and the inherent weakness of democratic peoples. Then the blizzard hit, one of the worst storms of the century. The snow fell so thick and fast that you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. The wind howled at 70 miles per hour, a screaming banshee that rattled the barracks walls. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero, with the wind chill making it feel even colder, a temperature where exposed skin freezes in seconds. The guards couldn't get from their quarters to the camp kitchen. The roads were buried under snowdrifts taller than a man. The camp was cut off. They would miss breakfast, and maybe lunch too. But then, miraculously, trucks appeared through the blinding snow. Local townspeople had organized a convoy. They'd loaded their trucks with heavy pots of hot soup and loaves of fresh bread. They drove through dangerous whiteout conditions, risking their lives on treacherous, invisible roads, to make sure enemy prisoners didn't go hungry. Herman stood at the barracks window, watching those trucks arrive like phantoms out of the mist. He watched Canadian civilians climb out into the screaming wind, struggling to stand upright, carrying heavy pots of soup toward the dining hall. These people had no reason to risk their lives for German prisoners. The prisoners had bombed their allies, killed their sons, and threatened their way of life. Nobody would have blamed the Canadians for staying safe at home by their fires and letting the prisoners miss a few meals. But they came anyway. That night, Herman wrote in his journal, his worldview lying in ruins around him. I understood for the first time that strength is not proved by crushing the weak. He wrote, it is proved by protecting them when no one would blame you for abandoning them. Everything I was taught about power and superiority was a lie. The Canadians are not weak because they show kindness. They are strong enough that they can afford to be kind. We Germans thought we were strong because we were hard and cruel. But real strength is what I saw today. Real strength is driving through a killing storm to feed your enemies. Other prisoners were having similar thoughts. They'd been taught that the German people were destined to rule because they were superior in every way. But the logic of their surroundings made that impossible to believe. if they were superior. Why did Canadian farmers have better equipment than German factories could make? Why did ordinary Canadian families have more food than German officers? Why did this supposedly backward colonial country treat prisoners better than Germany treated its own citizens? The propaganda fell apart when measured against reality. You couldn't ignore the food on your plate, the warm coat on your back, the heated barracks keeping you alive, and the simple human kindness shown by people who had every reason to hate you. The prisoners began to see themselves differently too. They weren't the heroes they'd imagined. They were young men who'd been lied to and used by a government that didn't care if they lived or died. The Canadians showed them what a real civilization looked like. And it wasn't built on conquest and racial theories. It was built on knowing how to live in a hard place and helping others learn to live there too. The war eventually ended, as all wars do, but for the German prisoners who'd learned to survive the Canadian winter, going home would prove harder than anything they'd endured in captivity. May 1946. The war had been over for a full year. Germany lay defeated, split down the middle between the Soviet Union on one side and America, Britain, and France on the other. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, had collapsed after just 12, leaving behind a continent of ash. Now the prison ships were running in reverse, carrying German prisoners back across the Atlantic to a homeland that no longer existed in any form they would recognize. Ernst Bauer stood on the deck of a transport ship, watching the Canadian coast disappear behind him into the fog. In his duffel bag, he carried everything he owned in the world: a heavy Canadian wool coat that had kept him warm through 5 winters, 2 pairs of thick socks knitted by a woman in Bowmanville, whose name he'd never learned, a book on modern agricultural techniques that the camp education officer had given him as a parting gift, and a small wooden cross carved by a fellow prisoner during the long winters. That was everything. His entire life fit in one canvas bag. The ship took 2 weeks to cross the Atlantic. Bauer stood at the rail every day, watching the gray water roll past, dread tightening his chest. Letters from the Red Cross had told him the basic facts, but facts could not prepare him for the reality. Hamburg was destroyed. 70% of the city was rubble. His family home no longer existed, just a pile of broken bricks and burnt wood where a house used to stand. His father had died in 1943, killed in the bombing. His mother had fled to Dresden to stay with relatives and died there when that city burned in the firestorm of February 1945. His younger brother was missing, probably dead somewhere on the frozen Eastern Front. There was nothing left of the life he'd known before the war. The ship docked at Hamburg in early June. Bauer walked down the gangplank, carrying his duffel bag, and stepped onto German soil for the first time in 6 years. The smell hit him first. It was a stench of old ash, wet decay, and human waste. The city smelled like death. He walked through streets he'd known as a boy but couldn't recognize now. Every building was damaged or destroyed. Walls stood without roofs, jagged teeth against the sky. Windows gaped empty like dead eyes. Rubble filled the spaces between broken buildings. Mountains of debris that had once been homes. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and gray and silent. He saw children digging through garbage piles, looking for anything edible: a potato peel, a crust of bread. Old women pulled carts loaded with salvage wood for cooking fires, their faces etched with exhaustion. Men with missing limbs sat on corners begging, wearing tattered remnants of uniforms. These were his people, Germans, the master race that was supposed to rule the world. They looked like they were barely surviving. Bauer found a refugee center where the Red Cross was helping returning prisoners. They gave him papers and ration cards. The ration cards entitled him to 200 calories per day if the food was available. Sometimes it wasn't. He thought about the 800 calories he'd eaten every day in the Canadian camp and felt physically sick with guilt. He thought about the Christmas feast with turkey and 3 kinds of pie and wanted to cry. His own people were starving while he'd spent the war eating better than he ever had in his life. The winter of 1946 and 1947 became known as the Hunger Winter. It was the coldest winter in Germany in 50 years. Temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for weeks. A relentless freeze that punished the ruins. There was no coal for heating because the mines weren't producing enough. There was no wood because people had already burned everything they could find: furniture, doors, floorboards. The buildings had no glass in the windows, just boards or cardboard that did nothing to keep out the killing cold. Bauer survived that winter only because of what Canadians had taught him. He found a group of families huddled in a partially destroyed apartment building. They were wearing everything they owned in single thick layers, shivering violently under thin blankets, slowly freezing to death. Bauer showed them the Canadian way. "Take off those heavy coats," he told them. His voice, authoritative, he taught them to layer thinner clothes with air between them to trap heat. The families looked at him like he was crazy, but they were desperate enough to try. Within an hour, they felt warmer than they had in weeks. He taught neighbors to bank snow against the outside walls for insulation, the same technique a Canadian guard had shown him years ago. He demonstrated how to recognize the white patches of frostbite on children's faces and how to warm the skin safely without causing damage. He shared his Canadian wool coat with an elderly woman who had nothing but newspapers wrapped around her shoulders. The coat saved her life. But even with that knowledge, people died. Thousands died from cold and hunger that winter. The cities were full of frozen bodies that nobody had the strength to bury until spring thawed the ground. Bauer survived. But he knew he was only alive because Canadians had cared enough to teach an enemy how not to freeze. Klaus Hermann, the former Hitler youth leader who'd watched Canadians risk their lives to bring soup through a blizzard, came home to find nothing. His parents were gone. His childhood home was a crater. He stood in the ruins of Berlin, surrounded by the physical manifestation of his former ideology's failure. But unlike many others who fell into despair, Hermann remembered the trucks in the snow. He remembered that strength was about rebuilding and protecting. He joined a reconstruction crew the next day. He worked with his hands, clearing rubble, salvaging bricks, helping to rebuild a city he had helped to destroy. He didn't speak of the war, or of glory, or of racial superiority. He spoke only of insulation, of structural integrity, and of the importance of feeding the hungry. He had left Germany as a soldier of the Reich, convinced that power was the only truth. He returned as a man who knew that the only truth worth fighting for was the warmth of human kindness in a freezing world. The winter had failed to kill them in Canada, and because of that, they possessed the strength to survive the winter of their nation's soul. His entire world had been pulverized. His family was gone. His city was nothing but smoldering rubble. Standing in the ruins, he faced a terrifying void: no job, no home, and absolutely no future. For 2 years, he struggled to resurrect a life in post-war Germany, but the atmosphere was suffocating. The people were spiritually broken. The economy shattered. Foreign soldiers occupied every street corner, serving as a constant, humiliating reminder that the invincible lies he had been force-fed were shattered by a gritty reality. Then, in 1948, a shockwave rippled through the hopelessness. Canada announced a radical immigration program. They were opening the door to the enemy. Former German prisoners of war could apply to return not as captives, but as free men, provided their records were spotless. No war crimes, no SS blood, no Nazi leadership. They wanted the regular soldiers, the men who had been captured, imprisoned, and were desperate for a clean slate. Hermann applied instantly. Bauer followed suit. Suddenly, thousands were clamoring for the chance. But why? This decision baffled the Germans left behind. Why would you willingly return to the site of your humiliation? Why travel thousands of miles back to the nation that had defeated and caged you? It seemed like absolute madness. But these former prisoners possessed a secret insight, a realization that others couldn't grasp. Canada hadn't been their prison. It had been their awakening. It was the place where the blindfold of propaganda was ripped away, revealing what a functioning civilization actually looked like. They had seen what real strength was built upon: Consider Horst Liebeck, the former U-boat officer, who once wrote home that he ate better in captivity than the high command in Berlin. Returned to Halifax, the very port where he'd first arrived in chains. He didn't hide. He became a marine engineer, using his deadly submarine expertise to design safety systems that helped Canadian fishermen survive the lethal North Atlantic. When pressed on why he returned to the scene of his defeat, his logic was piercing. Canada had taught him the difference between merely surviving and actually living. He chose to live. By 1953, the trickle turned into a wave. Approximately 6,000 former enemies returned to Canada. They didn't flee to the cities. They went back to the source. They brought wives and children to the very towns that had once guarded them behind barbed wire. They became farmers in Saskatchewan and Alberta, tilling the same soil they had worked as prisoners. They transformed into engineers, teachers, and merchants, embedding themselves in the communities that once viewed them as threats. Ernst Bauer purchased a farm in Saskatchewan in 1954. He didn't just farm, he applied a philosophy. He utilized agricultural techniques learned from Canadian farmers and a textbook a camp officer had kindly given him years prior. He raised 3 children with his German wife, teaching them to skate on the frozen pond behind their house. But more importantly, he taught them humanity. When blizzard struck, Bauer didn't isolate himself. He checked on his neighbors, mirroring the exact compassion Canadians had once shown him. He built a life in the land of his captors and never looked back. Then there was Klaus Hermann, who became a teacher in Lethbridge, mere miles from where the guard towers of Camp 133 once stood. He taught history and citizenship, but his real lesson was far more profound. He captivated his students with the truth about the war, about the toxic ideology he had believed, and how spectacularly wrong he was. He recounted the blizzard of February 1943, a moment of high drama where townspeople risked their lives to trek through snowstorms just to bring hot soup to enemy prisoners. He needed them to grasp the paradox. Your country defeated us. Herman told his breathless classes, not merely with superior weapons, but by showing us a superior way to be human. The greatest shock wasn't the freezing winter, it was the shattering of their worldview. They realized that everything Hitler said about strength was a lie. Real strength isn't letting your enemy freeze to prove you are tough. True power isn't cruelty. It is the courage to drive through a blizzard to feed men who cannot repay you. Genuine civilization, he argued, is building a society in the harshest climate on Earth, and then sharing the secrets of survival with everyone, even your enemies. This was the lesson that survived the war. It was the truth, Herman, Bauer, and 6,000 others carried in their hearts. The cold didn't kill them because Canadians refused to let it happen. This wasn't weakness. It was a deeper, more resilient strength. It was the power of a society that mastered winter through cooperation rather than domination. It was the strength of a people who understood that survival is a skill you must share, because that is what civilized human beings do. In the end, the German prisoners learned to endure the Canadian winter. But the twist was that survival alone was never the point. What truly mattered was how you survived, and who you lifted up along the way. That was the wisdom they brought back when they returned as free men. That was the legacy they passed to their children. That was the alchemy that turned enemies into neighbors and prisoners into patriots.